Okay, so part 2 of 4.8 day 1 is being able to find square roots of negative numbers. So if you take on your calculator the square root of negative any number, pick a number you want. And what it's going to do is it's going to give you an error because you can't take the square root of a negative number. Okay? So what they've done is they've figured out a way to kind of get around this here. And what they've done is said what they call the imaginary unit I, the letter I, is the complex number, okay, whose square is -1. So essentially, this is really important here. This is in your notes, that I is the square root of -1. So by changing the square root of -1 to I, we are able to now simplify a square root with a negative in it. So it says here, what we're going to do is we are going to take, for example, this square root of -5. Okay, so we have the square root of -5. Well, I'm going to rewrite that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of -1 times 5. Okay, and remember before we can split these guys up, -1 and the square root of 5. So now the square root of -1 is now I. So I'm not going to leave that in there. I'm going to change anytime I see a square root of -1, that's going to be I, and I can't break down the square root of 5. Okay? So as I look at these examples, what I got to do is I got to separate the negative, make it a -1 and that number, and then see if I can break it down or not. Okay? So let's take number 1 as an example here. So now I see this, I see square root of -2. So I'm going to break this down, square root of -1 times +2. And then I'm going to separate them, -1 and square root of 2. Square root of -1 is I. And can I break down the square root of 2? In other words, can I break down 2? No, I can't. So I just leave it as I square root of 2. Same thing with example number 2 here. Break them down, -1 and +7. Split them up. Square root of -1 is I, and the square root of 7. Can I break down the square root of 7? No, I can't, because 7 cannot be broken down, and you are done. Okay, so that's 1 and 2. Problem number 3, a little bit different now. Okay, so the first thing I've got to do here is now break down -1 and 18. So I've got separate them, square root of -1 and the square root of 18. The square root of -1 is I. 18, can I break 18 down? I sure can. 18 goes to 9 and 2. And then 3 and 3. So this is just what we did on the first page of today's 4.8 lesson. Okay? So now this is going to be times the square root of 2 times the square root of 3 squared. Now if you remember, square root cancel. So what I'm going to do now is put that 3 in front of the I. So it's going to be 3I. And then the square root of 2 does not have a square on it, so that stays inside. That's an example of one where you have to break it down. Okay, example number 4. This one, again, first thing I want to do is separate them. So it's -1 and 25. Separate your roots, square root of -1, square root of 25. Square root of -1 is I. And then 25 I can break down into 5 times 5. So that becomes the square root of 5 squared. Square root, go away. And I have I times 5. Well, if I have just a number times a letter, I always want to put that number in front. So that becomes 5I. Okay, so now you should be able to simplify all your roots with negative numbers on page 3 of your class kick examples.